Hi, I'm Stewart Spinks and welcome to episode 361 of my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. I was watching a TV series recently and the last episode was called The Season Finale. Well, rest assured this isn't my last podcast, but it certainly feels like the season has drawn to a close as we bring our bees back from the Borage and discover a near-starving colony. Beekeeping Short and Sweet, a beekeeping podcast for the inquisitive beekeeper with a short attention span. A beekeeper, in fact, just like me. This week's podcast is brought to you, in part, by Hive 5 Multi-Guard. So,
when you need a little peace of mind that your bees are safe from dangers of all kind, pesticides, hornets, wasps and mice are no match for Hive 5. The Hive 5 Multi-Guard is the best one in town. Keeps your bees safe all year round. The ultimate solution has been found. It's Hive 5.
The Hive 5 Multi-Guard fits nearly all beehives and makes beekeeping much easier. Hive 5.
Hi everyone, and welcome back to my podcast, Beekeeping Short and Sweet. Back again for my season finale, as I mentioned in the introduction, or rather, not so much a season finale, just an indication that the active season in terms of honey production is over. It feels sometimes like the season never ends. Such is the workload, and I'm sure there's lots of beekeepers out there that feel the same. And although it does ease through the winter in terms of working with our bees, there's always a lot to get on with in preparation for the new season, that following spring. Having said that, there is always a chance of a late crop of ivy honey, something we've not had for a few years recently, despite the ivy plants themselves looking incredibly healthy, producing lots of flowers and providing our colonies with masses of bright yellow pollen. It's an odd kind of honey, really, another one of those Marmite-type honeys that you either love or hate. Fresh from the comb, it can have a somewhat medicinal aftertaste, but left in the bucket for a few months, it seems to mellow and, for me, has a strong flavour in the same kind of way, same kind of group as heather honey maybe. If I compare it with borage honey, which is a mild-tasting honey, ivy honey really packs a punch by comparison. Of course, it sets solid in the comb, another reason for beekeepers to dislike it. The only way it's coming out of the comb is by melting the entire batch and separating the honey from the wax, so you end up destroying a lot of comb that the bees have worked hard to produce. We're not yet into the full-on nectar and pollen flow of the ivy, maybe a week or two away, and for most beekeepers it will simply be ignored as a problem crop rather than an opportunity of one last crop of honey before the winter arrives. Of course, if you want a crop of honey from it, treatments must either be completed and out of the hive or delayed until after the ivy has finished flowering. If this year is anything to go by, the ivy will be early and it will catch the end of our treatment period, so we won't be taking a crop from it once more. If it settles back into a later flowering time frame, who knows, we might pop a couple of supers on the strongest colonies and see what we get. Bringing the timeline back to now, we've just returned our bees from the Borage and pumpkins in Essex. There hasn't been any change in the numbers, so we went down with 31 colonies, and that included a few smaller nucleus-sized colonies. Of those, one has succumbed to the wasps and robbing, but that was a drone-laying queen colony, so all we've really lost is a chance to unite the adult workers with another queen-right colony. For those beginner beekeepers listening, a drone-laying queen colony occurs when something happens to the queen that stops her laying worker eggs. and then she's only able to lay drone eggs. Remember, worker eggs are fertilised, drone eggs are not. So there are several reasons a queen may become a drone layer. First off, if she is an older queen, she may simply have lived her life to the full and have run out of sperm to fertilise those eggs. This is more likely, I guess, for beekeepers with just a few colonies, as I generally find commercial beekeepers tend to replace queens more frequently than hobbyist beekeepers. Hobbyist beekeepers tend to hang on to the older queens for longer and only replace when there is an issue or perhaps the colony swarms and they naturally get a new queen as a replacement. Another reason the queen may have become a drone layer is a lack of drones to mate with early or late in the season. This results in the queen running out of sperm just when brood rearing is at its max, feeling to the beekeeper sometimes like a total disaster as the summer honey crop then looks totally out of reach, or just as the colonies are heading out of winter and the beekeeper has nurtured them through the late autumn treatments, feeding, midwinter oxalic acid treatments and fondant feeding, only to find no workers, just drones. An optimistic start to the season ruined by this discovery and the need to have to start all over again. Anyway, let's not dwell on that. We deal with it and move on. Back at the borage and pumpkins, it decided to rain, which for once proved fortuitous, as it meant we could block the entrances, check the straps and get the bees onto the trailer and home easier and earlier than expected. The journey home was uneventful, I'm glad to say, and the work we had done previously in preparing the apiary meant everything was in place for an easy drop-off. The long grass and weeds were cut back to the ground, pallets double stacked and in place, and everywhere generally tidied up so there were no big branches for us to have to drive over. Our bees had done a great job for the borage and pumpkin farmer. I think we were probably a week or so too late for the borage this year. It flowered earlier than expected, and the farmer was a little late in telling me. With the near-drought conditions prevailing for most of the summer, there appeared to be little nectar being produced by the plants, and so honey yields for me personally were down significantly. The farmer reported an average crop yield in terms of seed production, so it appears our bees did a good job across the acres and acres of borage they wanted pollinating. I guess it stands to reason. Less nectar means our bees having to visit more flowers to fill up with nectar, and more pollen therefore being spread between plants. The pumpkins, on the other hand, seem to have produced really well. We got pollen and nectar from them, turning the honey into a light golden colour. The yield from the pumpkins was mainly due to the copious amounts of irrigation that was pumped across all of the field, and this undoubtedly allowed the pumpkin plants to produce that extra nectar and huge amounts of pollen. The bees could be seen covered in the stuff returning to the hives. Looking across the pumpkin fields on our final day, it was obvious the bees had done a good job. I don't think I've ever seen so many pumpkins before, and all shapes and sizes. It should be a fun Halloween this year if you're carving pumpkins. So we have our bees back at the farm on the outskirts of Norwich, and with it another year of moving bees to pollinate crops and back comes to an end. We now have 4 overwintering apiary sites with around 20 to 30 colonies at each site. This is not the normal number of colonies I would keep at these locations. It's too many for the available forage that they would have during the active season. But for overwinter periods, it's perfect. It keeps the colonies close to home, in manageable, easily accessible and secure locations. Another important consideration is winter weather. None of these locations are liable to flooding, apart from maybe one at the fishing lakes, which has been close to flooding in the past, but only in very extreme situations. In this apiary, I've made sure the colonies most likely to be at risk are on raised pallets, so if we do have an exceptionally floody year, we'll lose the pallets and the hives. Hopefully, I'll have enough warning to get down there and do something about it, if that's the case. Thinking back to the bees we've just returned from the Borage, we did find one colony that required some emergency feeding. I've documented this in our latest video, so do check that one out. It's video number 48, called Emergency Fondant Feed. Of all the colonies to come back from the Borage, it was the only one that felt significantly at threat of starvation right now. So I dropped a large bag of fondant on them, and that should recover the situation nicely. I won't start the autumn-winter feeding until later in the month. This is because I'm feeding fondant. There's a subtle difference between feeding autumn syrup and fondant, and it helps to think about how these two options are affected by the colder nights we will no doubt encounter in the near future. Syrup, fed in the autumn, ideally needs to be heavy syrup or 2-to-1 syrup. Beekeepers get really hung up on the quantities and weights being spot on, but actually you can get away with an awful lot when it comes to feeding bees. They are very forgiving. That said, from this point onwards, feeding light syrup forces the bees to have to remove more water from the mix than they can easily do, so it's much more easier for them in the late summer when temperatures are generally higher. Water evaporates faster and they can deal with it quickly. But at this point in the season, it makes sense to help out our bees when feeding by giving them heavy syrup. Less water to remove before it's ready to store. Any light syrup that gets stored with higher water content percentages is likely to turn mouldy or ferment through the winter, and this can cause the bees challenges in terms of causing dysentery, fouling the brood combs in the dark cold of winter. The other issue with feeding syrup is that it acts as a heat sink. It cools very, very quickly, and that draws the temperature away from the bees. Fondant, I find, is not quite so cold when it comes to the bees feeding on it. And I think I've mentioned before, my reason for feeding fondant is because we have loads, or at least we had loads. I've been working my way through it consistently over the past couple of months, with the bulk of the food going into the nukes we've created. And that will continue for several weeks still. Now that we're feeding the full-size colonies as well, the fondant is going to disappear very quickly. Personally, I think I'll simply buy in another pallet of fondant. It isn't messy, it stores well, and we can cut it up into smaller blocks when necessary, simply and quickly. Something else that I need to consider in the coming weeks is how we protect our colonies, or more specifically the hives, from the green woodpecker. These rather splendid looking birds can quickly bash a hole into the side of a wooden beehive. This then doesn't bode well for my polyhive and is a major drawback of that material. Interestingly, our colonies at the different locations seem to come under different pressures from the woodpeckers. The colonies at the fishing lakes have not been targeted for many, many years now, whereas the hives located at the farm are the most likely to find themselves being damaged. The woodpecker turns its attention onto the hives when the weather gets really cold, the ground freezes solid, and it's unable to find the more regular target of its feeding habits, that being ants nesting in the ground. I often see woodpeckers rummaging around the ground at the fishing lakes, and not just through the winter, yet at the farm they seem to quickly turn their attention to the hives, even when the warmer weather allows them to go in search of more natural food sources. The easiest way to protect our hives here is by wrapping them in chicken wire. It's quick and effective, and as a note to myself, I mustn't forget to protect the top of the hive too, the roof. I've had a couple of poly roofs damaged with holes all the way through to the clear coverboard beneath, and it can be costly if the damage is severe, but mostly it means additional repair work using filler to plug the hole through the winter. We don't have any other real damage threats to the hives. I've never had cattle, sheep or deer cause any damage to our hives before, mainly because of placement and location, so that's not really something I need to worry about, fingers crossed. I'm also starting to think about next season. I know it's early, but you do have to plan. The best way to plan is to reflect on what's happened this year And to say it's been an unusual year is something of an understatement. The warmest UK year on record and very low rainfall all meant our season started early and ended early, or at least that's how it's felt. With that in mind, one of the main areas I want to focus on next season is cropping a bigger blackberry honey crop. It's one of my favourites and seems to have given up a nectar flow in line with all the other plants, that's to say earlier than usual. This means having our bees ready for that specific crop in late May or very early June, whereas normally I would expect it to deliver from mid to late June, through into July even. So for me, we need the colonies that are designated as honey production colonies building up on the oilseed rape earlier than normal, maybe giving us a crop there first, but ready to be moved back to the brambles as soon as the first flowers appear, regardless of the state of the OSR. Here I'm torn, because I also like the soft set honey we produce using the OSR flow. Maybe it will have to be some and some, split between the two locations initially until the oilseed rape is over and we can quickly get the colonies back to the brambles. An awful lot of this planning is going to be weather dependent once again, and we can only cross our fingers and hope that we get a fair run at it all once more. Well, that's it for this week. For all of you who haven't yet signed up to my Patreon page, I, together with Steph, have been creating beekeeping content for many years now. And if you're looking for some straightforward, down-to-earth tips and techniques, help and advice, then do take a look at my Patreon page. We have over 1,600 individual beekeeping posts, videos and podcasts filled with useful and timely help and advice. My approach is pragmatic and calm, sometimes entertaining, but always with help and support for beekeepers at the heart of what I do. I keep my videos short and concise wherever possible, no waffle, no flannel, just honest beekeeping advice from years of keeping bees. Take a look and join me for the new 2025 beekeeping season. It'll cost you less than a jar of honey. Head over to Google and search for Patreon and the Norfolk Honey Company.